All right. So first of all, I openly admit that last video about Sargon was pretty shit. But this is one reason I don't really promote my channel is because I don't want to be out there saying, "Oh, you should watch this content," because sometimes I want to put up a video like that where really, if I was watching it, I would have stopped watching probably when it was obvious that I, the video maker, was no longer watching the video, but was just playing guitar. The thing is, I meant to pause and talk and pause and talk, but I hadn't watched the video. It was totally a cold run through. So, it took me by surprise that it was about infighting. So now that I've watched that and his own response to that text comments in that video, I do have a comment, and I think that it's an opinion, and it's sort of pertinent to what's going on. So now I've noticed this in looking at the history of movements, and also I've noticed this over and over in sort of an accelerated way in online communities. I've been online since the mid-'80s. I've seen communities form. People have real-life meetups and activist communities. And so, this happened in the atheist community. It happened in political blogging. It happens in the microcosms of all sorts of communities. People get together and they're like, wow, really? You want to talk about knitting with, only green yarn? Wow, I didn't know there was somebody else into that. And they all feel like this sense of unity, but eventually, the differences break up, and they're like, what, you use that stitch? That's a stitch for lazy people. The factions then grow. Then whoever is the owner, the private owner of this forum, usually ends up being the arbiter of purges where people get sent off. It happens at, like a liberal example, certainly the Daily Kos. I was one of the early users there. This happened there. And actually that one was over feminism too, to a large degree. At least that was a precipitating event. So, so evidently Sargon seeing this kind of thing in the Gamergate community, which, granted, okay, probably the best way to talk about what is that, because to me, Gamergate, the name sounds like Watergate, and it means it's the name of a scandal. Oh, but it's a hashtag, and the hashtag is used for all kinds of, related things. What's it really mean then? Okay, I don't know. It's just a hashtag. Who cares? And that's kind of what Sargon's saying, but there's people that are developing the second stage of once your movement attracts some people and gains some ground. Doesn't mean it's changing society, but it grows. These purists come in, and these people that want everybody to conform, these groupthink jerks. That always happens in these movements. And so now in feminism, this has happened decades, 50 years ago or something at least. And so we have these divisions, these factions within activism, including feminism, but also labor and all of the areas, between certain fundamental disagreements where people that have come to the same conclusion, like, oh, women's rights are worth thinking of, have disagreements that maybe are really important to them, sometimes more important to them. And then the Gamergate attitude seems to be find a faction of feminists that I've already am a part of disagreements going back decades, and use them to malign me as well. Say, see, this proves that the philosophy is inherently inconsistent. Well, you'll have some factions develop, and people from this so-called feminist camp will point the finger at the most abhorrent of you guys and try to paint all of you that way, right? You ever heard of that happening? Yeah, probably have. So the proper solution that nobody seems to really want to do, but this is what I try to do, is find the best faction and the best individuals of a given ideology. So, for example, people think they're having trouble with the Muslims and the Muslim way of looking at things and philosophies that have come from the Muslim tradition. Well, just go find some Muslims that have a positive interpretation of the tradition, ethics, and they don't exist. Yeah, no, they totally do exist. You don't know the factions within the Muslims. They go back to after Muhammad died. All right, so there's some huge differences, some differences between Muslims internally that are bigger, way bigger, more intimate and personal to them than any of the differences you think you have with them as a whole. And if you find the people that don't believe in terrorism, then you can promote them. And this is actually the long-term way, and history does show that this is the long-term way, when the ethical and people of character of given schools of thought or activism or what have you, when they get together, they can take out the positive and the grains of truth and make something positive out of them together in an alliance. And sometimes it even proves that there's a balance there. So, like, for example, with feminism and men's rights activism, a real positive men's rights activism and a truly positive feminism, they're in concert and balance, right? It's like they would both be allies saying we need, there's some gender-related diseases. We need to study those diseases. Let's look at all of them together instead of saying, here's how much breast cancer, how prostate. Let's say, well, of course, these only affect mostly half of the population. Let's add them together and see what the real cost of this kind of thing is, and or whatever. I'm just saying you get creative, and there's reasons that feminists and civil rights activists should be allies. Now, myself, I'm basically a peace activist, and all of the fields of activism have reason to be peace activists because, for example, war creates a worse situation for women. The aftermath of war is almost invariably worse for women. It creates a worse situation in women. The racism, as a matter of fact, the Muslim stuff that we're seeing now, I mean, Iraq's a perfect example. Before the first Iraq war, it was run very, very secularly. Afterwards, it was still run sort of secularly, but they put some Islamic symbols on their flag and stuff, and they reverted it, created more of negative situations in terms of tolerance, in terms of looking to religious institutions rather than secular institutions like education and, like public education and things like that. So, naturally, I believe that these international geopolitical scale examples, when you have a geopolitical scale example, that takes precedence because those are the result of war. When you have people in Bangladesh being treated, in sweatshop slavery situations, that doesn't mean it's not important, like the workspace ergonomics of office workers' chairs. That's still important. Their labor issues, but the international issue is more serious, and frankly, it's because of war. War is going back quite a while. I mean, the situation in Bangladesh and why they allow and even want this sweatshop system to happen, is related to the history of war over in whatever you want to call it, in India, British, and Dutch influence and so on in Southeast Asia, the South Pacific, whatever. So, I think one, it's inevitable that this kind of infighting and the group thinkers have an influence, and you'll find in a particular forum that the more the conformists will win, and the individuals, they won't tie together as individuals, and they'll get spit out, in fives and tens and whatnot, and that's just the way that it goes. So this is one of the reasons, one of the things, the troll culture understands and is sort of savvy about its cynicism about this stuff, I think, is based on this reality that groupthink and infighting is just an inevitable thing that happens after a movement feels it's grown to a certain state. And it's just fundamentally not fair or productive to look in the factions of your opponents and choose the worst one and try to act like they're all that way. All the factions are like that. You should look at the best one, right? And so, Bolsheviks versus Menkovits or whatever they were. The Bolsheviks were the majority, but, the other guys had a better idea. And that's how we should look at the world, without fear that, the whole thing, it's corrupt, it's this, it's that. Let's look practically. I mean, religion, for example, is a bit batshit crazy in a certain respect, but not everybody that believes in that religion is, or has bad character or bad ideas or can't do this or that other unrelated job. So, I mean, Thunderfoot should be able to do his lab work, whether no matter what, if he's right wing extremist or not, and Laughing Witch should probably be able to, restore porcelain, whether she's a crazy libtard or whatever. So it's just like it's that's beside the point. And if we're trying to find out solutions to real problems, solutions to imagined problems being, stop imagining them, then this is what we have to do. You have to find the most reasonable person in the other camp uh, with which to argue, not even necessarily to negotiate. Not necessarily can you find a common ground still, but just the conversation itself should be between these two most reasonable people. That sheds the most light on the real issue, because I'll tell you what, in the long run, what's going to happen is neither one of you two schools are going to win. You're going to be in balance and arguing for years until some later generation comes up with a synthesis, a view that balances the two, which to both of us, these two parties now, would seem like a totally third view. Probably both sides would disagree with it. That's why they had not come up with it themselves. And this is called the progress of ideas. So, but if you want to attack the most despicable and try to strike them out and do purges and, figure out how to find these people and get them out of this, tenure and whatever you're going to do with them, that will never work. You'd be better off strengthening the people that are reasonable in, the most reasonable camp in the opposing forces, and cooperating with them, creating a third way with them. And I know this for a fact.